In medieval Europe, people perceived the world through a very different lens than we do today. In this era, when it was believed that invisible forces shaped daily life, it was thought that spirits, demons, and semi-spurious beings inhabited every corner of nature. When a storm broke out, burst, when the harvest rotted, evil eye had struck. When a baby fell ill and died, the neighbor's secret spell was at work. This worldview was the fertile ground where the seeds of witchcraft were sown. The concept of the witch did not stem from a single source. And religious traditions that intertwined over the centuries. The folk beliefs of Germanic, Anglo-Saxonic, and Scandinavian peoples, inherited from antiquity, spoke of sacred women, Hillens, and unfirmed in sync with the lunar cycles. In these traditions, there were wise women who could bridge the ordinary world with they were feared. They were both feared and sought out. As Christianity spread across Europe, the Church was forced to confront these ancient beliefs. In the early period, Church Fathers argued that witches and sorcerers did not actually exist, claiming they were nothing more than empty folk superstitions. Documents such as the Pactus Legis Alamanorum, drafted in the 8th century, characterized those who believed in witchcraft as people deluded by error and punished them. Not the practitioners of magic, but those who believed in it. Initial official stance, however, attitude would undergo a reformation in the later centuries of the Middle Ages. Behind this change lay both theological shifts and that were ravaging Europe: plague, epidemics, famines, wars, and religious flux, left in a staple of profound uncertainty. Minds seeking ants turned invisible enemies. The heart of medieval beliefs about witchcraft lay a theological idea. Witches were people who made an explicit pact with the devil worshipped him, and in return acquired supernatural powers. This idea matured over the centuries and became ingrained in Europe's collective consciousness. By the 13th century, when scholastic theology, untheologistic, reached its peak, thinkers like St. Thomas Aquinas began to systematically examine the nature of the devil and his influence over humans. The devil was real, powerful, and would try every means to conquer souls. This theological framework was the intellectual foundation for the witch hunts of the coming centuries. By the 15th century, the form of this belief had become distinct, a Sabbat ritual in which witches gathered at night, worshipped the devil, took on an increasingly concrete form in church sermons and subsequent texts. It was claimed that in this ritual, children were killed, animals were sacrificed, physical union with the devil occurred. These images reflected the fears of the church and society at the time rather than reality. In Funan reality. In 1887, Toad 87's Toad Dominican friars Johann Sprenger and Heinrich Kramer authored a book that would leave a deep mark on history. Maleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. This work detailed the methods for identifying, interrogating, and judging witches. It presented in witchery the diary and abrides regarding sexuality, the devil, and the female body. As one of the first products of the printing press era, the book spread rapidly and became a guide's Europe, and the journal head of the great witch hunts and theological debates, recorded by history. There was a very different reality to everyday life. In villages, towns, and lived women and men who knew plants well, assisted with childbirth, provided healing, and were trusted people. They were called the cunning folk. These people were not witches in the sense we understand today. Within their communities, they were respected, even indispensable figures. They prepared herbal mixtures to heal the sick, consulted them to find aesthetics, and sought their help to break evil spells. Hundreds of court records documenting the existence of this folk magic tradition in England, Germany, the Scandinavian countries, and Italy have survived to the present day. Carlo Ginzburg's research in Italy brought to light the Nandantaitanci tradition in the Friuli region. According to their own accounts, these individuals would have the dies night at the right, and since the devil and predelict villages' crops. The Church's Inquisition Beeson. These defensive warriors were gradually equated with witches. It is possible to trace how their beliefs were transformed through their own words. Often arose from the Church's food beliefs. Folk beliefs. A healer trusted by the local people could be transformed into a servant of the devil before a judge. In medieval Europe, the Church established a special judicial mechanism called the Inquisition formalized by Pope Gregory IX in the 13th century. This institution was primarily known to activities targeted such as the Cathars and the Waldensians. Over time, accusations of witchcraft also came to dominate the Inquisition's agenda. The operation of the Inquisition courts from Inquisition's principles. The accused was required to prove their innocence. If they could not, they were deemed guilty. In this system, where confession held great importance, torture was accepted as a judicial tool. However, historians emphasize that there were significant regional variations in the application of torture, and that some Inquisitive courts quite scattered the disgrace the spans a species. The stance of the Spanish Inquisition, if it is striking in this regard. Alonso de Salazar Farias, who investigates in absentia the Navarra Mura ed ducted a meticulous inquiry. He heard thousands of witnesses as examined the incidents and ultimately wrote, I could not find a single piece of concrete evidence proving that even a single case true. This outcome allowed the Spanish Inquisition remain relatively untouched by the witch panic that swept across much of Europe. In Northern Europe, however, the picture was very different. Wherever it be in higher and lower courts weak, local judges could act with broad discretion. This situation led to a chain of accusations and mass trials. Some areas, the historians today states that between 40,000 and 50,000 people were executed during the witch hunt, which said when 50 brun under 50 to tonsensality sem 750. This figure is far removed from the Marines often to public culture. The intensity of the witch hunts showed in an extremely uneven geographical distribution. The Holy Roman Empire, encompassing the territories of Mordred, Germany, Switzerland, and Luxembourg, was the region with the highest executions during this period. Political fragmentation played a key role here. There was no control lordships, principalities, and church lands. Each local ruler had nearly completely judicial authority over their own territory. Scotland was one of the countries with the highest density witch hunts to its population. King James CI's personal obsession with witchcraft a decisive role in accelerating this process. James believed he had been the victim of a witch attack in the teen 90s and the 20s, in perseverant interrogation sessions. After ascending, he codified his beliefs in a treatise on a treatise titled in Afimunon Chevan in 1597. In T997, the witch panic erupted in the Mora and Dalarna regions of Sweden in Seats and Sweden in 1669 and cases 69 and 679 since observance as a striking example of how children's testimonies as killings could escalate into a storm of mass trials. The children described being taken to being intanked and brought into a magical at night and serving the devil there. These statements quickly led to the arrest of hundreds of people. English in the wider world, the Salem witch trials, which took place in what is now Massachusetts, occurred in 692. This crisis, which erupted in the Puritan England, and the Negging and the Communal Amusu. Among the communities, the Salem trials were a reflection of Urian tradition trend. Transplanted to the New World and represented the final examples of the witch-hunting era. Historical records show that the vast majority of those accused are women. Estimates place them between 70 and 80% of the total. However, this ratio varied considerably from region to region. In Iceland and Estonia, most of those accused were men. Historians explain geographical differences by how local cultures and understandings were shaped. Texts like the Malleus Maleficarum reflected deep misogyny in the targeting of women. These texts described women as inherently closer to weaker intellects. Twitter inclined them in pleasures. This perspective placed women who deviated from society in an vulnerable position. An examination of the social profiles of those accused reveals certain patterns. Widows, elderly women, and indigenous spiritual exclusion are disproportionately overrepresented. Ongoing disputes with neighbors, old grudges, and property disputes lie behind many of the accusations. Reading court records clearly shows Mank not only as an abstract fear, but also as a cultural reckoning on the other hand, even those from the upper echelons of society sometimes could not escape accusations. In the Waves trials, in the Wurzburg region of Germany, prominent figures, the city priests, and even children were executed. These examples demonstrate that the dynamic of animation can, accusation, after a certain point, it create its own logic and transcend initial social patterns. Uncha. M. Broom, cauldron, and brood con and brood proogens that come to mind when one thinks of witchings of witches in popular culture are a symbolic reflection of historical reality. In the Middle Ages, the boundary between folk medicine and magic was far more blurred than magic and May and knowledge of plants, religious lints, and symbolic actions were intertwined. The belief that witches flew on broomsticks has been linked to glycerics of certain plant substances. Plants such as belladonna, henbane, and mandrake contain alkaloids. When applied to the skin or burned and inhaled, can induce hallucinatory experiences, such as flying and being struck by lightning. Some ingredients in mixtures refer as witch ointments. Ointments in period documents points. However, this connection remains a subject of debate in historical scholarship. Healers across different regions of Europe possessed extensive botanical knowledge passed down through generations. This knowledge encompassed both healing and potentially harmful substances. Healer Hook Summers' illness could later be branded the same botanical knowledge if that person was accused of a crime. Records frequently document accusation directed at midwives and women who prayed. This points to a pattern that it historically termed the Mifri myth, the actual prevalence of which remains a matter of debate. While some feminists highlight connection, some historians argue that evidence supporting a systematic link and mid-link between midwives and witches remains limited, and contrary to the widespread belief that witch hunts were a product of the relationship between the church and the state. The picture is far more complex. At certain times, church authorities to revengeful cohorts and overzealous judges. Occasionals of prevent with accusations. The Reformation process also significantly influenced this dynamic, as Protestant and denominations diverged in the 16th. The pressure on both sides to stems the devil's intricacies increased. Interestingly, witch hunts intensified in Protestant and Catholic regions. This indicates that we're not the product of a single denomination. When examining the role of state authority, it is evident that centralized That's powerful state cause, powerful separate morph break mechanism against witch panics. In France, the Parliament of Paris regularly over the overturned death sentences issues fils de epithets significantly distinguished French statistics from those of other regions. Meanwhile, in England, judicial oversight gained strength at an earlier stage and compared to other countries. Economic incentives were some regions, some dams. In some regions, the property of the condemned was confiscated and transferred to local officials. This created interest, and in some cases, there is strong evidence, financial motives, the accusations. The most compelling documents to survive from mid-medieval and early modern are the Mabisque trials, are confessions made by the accused themselves. These documents are also the most problematic, as the vast majority were or extract torture or severe coercion. When you read a confession, you notice a specific structure. How the devil was encountered, how the pact was made, what spells were cast, and who attended the Sabbath. This structure stems from the questions asked by the judges. During the interrogation process, the accused learned the answer. They expected to validate it. Historians refer to this as a learned confession. However, some confessions present a much more complex picture. In cases like Benedetti trials studied by Carlo Ginzensberg, the accused presented narratives did not to the judges of his. These transformed as they were forced into the judge's framework. This process demonstrates that confess, but all regions, but also gradations, but also reveal how genuine Fald Binun Wirias were reshaped at Vation table. Made without coercion are also recorded. Some individuals came forward of own volition, driven by deep inner conviction and remorse. In Fenselware, professions were valuable to understand the spirit atmosphere of the era and how deeply rooted the belief in the devil was from the late 17th saint onward. The number began to decline significantly. There is no single cause behind this decline. The rise of scientific thought, changes in illegal understanding, the strengthening of central governments, and public fatigue with the outcomes of these trials all played a role. The role of science is often overstated. The shift in understanding of nature brought about by Francis Bacon Galileo and Galileo did not immediately put an end to witch hunts. Many eating scientists were individuals who believed in witchcraft. The change stemmed not from a clear break between Stition and from Wissensfrick in mindset. Were more sized. As restrictions on torture strengthened, the number of confessions declined. As standards of evidence were raised, chain accusations were curtailed. English law decriminalized in the late 6th, in Devon 36, in 736X, and Prussia did Sums 14. The last of the official witch execution in Switzerland took place since Omnisemblance in 782. The belief in witchcraft itself, however, persisted. Rural communities in black magic and folk sorcerers and sorcered and into the 19th century, and in some regions even into the 20th century. When the legal system decriminalizes something it has been erased from social. Medieval witch trials attracted interest from historians, feminists, literary scholars, and artists since the 19th century. While this interest has understood it of its historical reality, it has also, at times, distorted it. The 19th century Romantic tradition, particularly Jules Michelet's 1860 Michelet's Athelis e Julther Associator, Raymondage as a symbol of resistance to patriarchal church oppression. In this interpretation, witches were the bearers of an ancient and free feminine wisdom, although historically wisdom gained greater traction and continues to persist in many circles today. Second wave feminism reinterpreted intent, a concrete symbol of women's historical oppression. Some scholars, however, argued this approach instrumentalized the actual victims and oversimplified historical. This tension persists in historical writing. The reinterpretation of the Salem trials during the Blacklists and England and the McCarthy years in America demonstrates the special resonances political events. Oster Miller's 1953 play The Crucible established Salem as an allegory, directly comparing it to McCarthyism. This play reframed the witch trials as troubles, a universal civic lesson on political oppression and mass hysteria. It is a historian's task to present as accurately as possible or is possible what these trials were really about, who's accused, and their causes and consequences. These trials are both a product of the specific historical of them, and provide a foundation up for husking about human orations or abomin. How does a society, when it believes in an invisible enemy, succumb to a fear that transcends itself? How do individuals become both accusers and the accused? How does the justice system turn upside down witchcraft beliefs? The early modern period were not the product of an isolated superstition, but rather a complex system in which theology, law, social tensions, and human psychology were intertwined. Understanding this system propice both the past and humanity's universes to fear. Did witches with magically exist in history? No, but did real people live suffer, endure pain, and lose their lives in those courtrooms, interrogation chambers, and public squares? Yes. And their story is not jot of their own eony. It is part of humanity's shared heritage. Fears change, targets change, but the dynamic of believing in the existence of an invisible threat and project that repeats throughout history. Recognizing this may the most valuable lesson history offers us.